He was only 8 years old, but Matthew Harrison already knew what it meant to be judged by appearances. That Tuesday afternoon, he walked into the Manhattan branch of First National Bank, carrying his 6-month-old brother, his clothes dirty after a day at the park and his hair messy from the wind. Branch manager Jessica Stone looked him up and down and, without asking questions, ordered security to escort him out. What she didn't know was that Matthew was the son of Alexander Harrison, owner of 60% of that same bank's shares, and one of America's richest men. The boy was just trying to find his dad, who was waiting upstairs for an important meeting. But when Alexander discovered how they had treated his son, his reaction was so devastating that no one in that bank would ever forget it. Because sometimes it takes just a few seconds to ruin a career and prove that arrogance always costs more than you think. Matthew Harrison had learned early that the adult world was complicated. At 8 years old, with his messy brown curls and those green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, he knew how to move confidently through office buildings and conference rooms. His father Alexander often brought him along when he had to work weekends or during school holidays, and Matthew had developed unusual maturity for his age. That Tuesday in October was no different from others. Alexander had to attend a crucial meeting on the 12th floor of First National Bank Manhattan, the financial institution he owned a majority stake in. Matthew had come along with little Lucas, 6 months old, because the nanny was sick, and Alexander's wife was on a business trip to London. The morning had passed quietly in the executive offices. Matthew had done his homework in the waiting room, while Alexander discussed financial strategies, and little Lucas slept peacefully in his carrier. But around 2 in the afternoon, Alexander had to go down to the vault for a security check that required only his presence. Matthew stayed behind to wait responsibly, used to these moments when he had to be the big brother. But after 20 minutes of waiting, Lucas started crying, and nothing could calm him down. The baby was hungry, and the bottle was in the bag Alexander had taken with him. Matthew knew there was an internal cafe on the ground floor where they also sold milk and cookies. He had seen his father buy things there often. He picked up his crying brother and headed for the elevator. The problem was that during the descent, Lucas vomited on Matthew's shirt, also staining his jeans. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Matthew looked like a street kid. Stained clothes, hair disheveled from trying to calm his brother, and an expression of worry that made him seem smaller than his 8 years. The bank lobby was full of wealthy clients and executives in suits and ties. Matthew looked around, searching for the cafe, but all those elegant people suddenly made him feel out of place. He timidly approached the information desk, where a young employee looked at him with confusion. When he politely asked where the cafe was because his little brother was hungry, the employee brusquely interrupted him, saying this was a bank, not a daycare. At that moment, Jessica Stone, the branch manager, was crossing the lobby returning from a meeting. She was 45 years old, a career built on efficiency and rigor, and a reputation as a woman who tolerated no irregularities. When she saw that dirty child disturbing the clients, her reaction was immediate and ruthless. Jessica approached with determined steps, observing Matthew from head to toe. She noticed the dirty clothes, the crying baby, the disheveled appearance. She didn't ask where he came from, didn't care that he had taken the elevator from the upper floors, didn't notice that the baby carrier was an expensive brand. She only saw what she wanted to see, a problem to eliminate. Without listening to Matthew's explanations, as he desperately tried to say his father was on the 12th floor, Jessica declared this was a private bank, not a place to beg for handouts. She immediately called security. 2 security guards approached, while Jessica pointed at Matthew as if he were a criminal. She ordered them to escort the children out and make sure they didn't return. Matthew felt his world collapse. He didn't understand what was happening, why these people were treating him this way. He tried to explain again that his father was waiting for him, but no one wanted to listen. The guards took him gently but firmly by the arms and escorted him toward the exit, while all the bank's clients watched with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. As he was being taken away, Matthew desperately shouted that his father's name was Alexander Harrison and that he was upstairs begging them to verify. But Jessica had already turned her back, convinced she had solved an annoying problem. She didn't know that at that moment she had just made the biggest mistake of her career, and that Alexander Harrison, one of America's most powerful men, was about to discover that his son had been kicked out of his own bank like a beggar. Alexander Harrison finished his inspection in the bank vault with the satisfaction of someone who knows every detail is under control. At 40 years old, he had built a financial empire that extended from America to Europe, and First National Bank Manhattan was the crown jewel. He owned 60% of the shares, had transformed a struggling institution into one of the country's most solid banks. When he returned to the 12th floor expecting to find Matthew and Lucas in the waiting room, he found only emptiness and silence. His personal assistant, Elena Martinez, saw him enter with a worried expression and explained that the children had left about an hour earlier. Matthew had said he was going to get something for his little brother. Alexander felt a cold chill run down his spine. Matthew was responsible for his age, but he was still an 8-year-old boy in an office building full of strangers. He immediately called internal security to check the cameras from the last hour. The answer came after a few minutes that seemed eternal to Alexander. The security chief's voice was tense, embarrassed. His son had been escorted out of the bank about 40 minutes earlier. The branch manager had ordered the guards to remove the children because she had mistaken them for beggars. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander remained motionless for long seconds, while rage mounted inside him like a tide. His son, the heir to his empire, had been kicked out of his own bank like a vagrant. And what drove him crazy most was imagining the confusion and humiliation Matthew must have felt. When he asked where the children were now, security confirmed that external cameras had recorded them sitting on the steps of the main entrance. They seemed to be waiting. Alexander didn't say another word. He took the elevator and went down to the ground floor with a determination that would have made anyone tremble. When the doors opened in the lobby, everyone turned toward him. Alexander Harrison in person at First National was always an event, but that day there was something different in his presence, an aura of approaching storm that made everyone uncomfortable. He headed straight for the main exit, and what he saw broke his heart. Matthew was sitting on the marble steps of the bank with Lucas in his arms, who had finally calmed down. The boy had red eyes as if he had been crying, and when he saw his father, his face lit up with relief. Matthew shouted, calling him, and ran toward him, saying he didn't know what to do after they made him leave. Alexander hugged him tight, feeling his son's small figure tremble against him. At that moment he swore to himself that whoever had done this to Matthew would pay dearly. He took Lucas from Matthew's arms and asked his son to tell him exactly what had happened. With his voice still shaky, Matthew explained everything. How he had gone down to look for milk for Lucas, how the manager had treated him without even listening, how he had been taken out by the guards despite saying he was Alexander Harrison's son. Every word was like a dagger to Alexander's heart. His son had tried to say who he was, but no one had believed him. They had judged him only by appearance, without dignity, without respect, without humanity. When Matthew asked with innocence why that lady had been so mean, and if he had done something wrong, Alexander looked at his son and saw in the boy's eyes a confusion that shouldn't be there. Matthew had always lived in a world where he was protected, respected, loved. This was the first time he experienced prejudice and gratuitous cruelty. Alexander assured him he had done nothing wrong, but that some people had. He stood up with his 2 sons and went back into the bank. But this time he was no longer the important client who came to check his investments. He was a furious father who had to seek justice for his son's humiliation. And everyone at First National Bank Manhattan was about to discover what it meant to anger Alexander Harrison. Alexander walked through the bank lobby with Matthew holding his hand and Lucas in his arms. His pace was measured, controlled, but everyone who knew him could recognize the signs. Employees began whispering as they saw him pass, recognizing the child next to him as the one who had been escorted out an hour earlier. He headed first to the information desk, where the employee who had rejected Matthew turned pale instantly upon seeing him approach. With a dangerously calm voice, Alexander asked if she remembered speaking with his son. The realization of what she had done crossed her face like a wave of terror. Alexander headed toward the stairs, deliberately ignoring the executive elevator. He wanted everyone to see him, wanted the news to spread before his arrival at Jessica Stone's office. When he opened the door without knocking, Jessica was on the phone. The phone slipped from her hands when she recognized who had entered. She jumped up, trying to appear accommodating, but Alexander interrupted her by pointing to Matthew. Jessica looked at the child and felt her world collapse. It was the same one she had kicked out, but now everything took on a completely different meaning. She began stammering something about a misunderstanding. Alexander explained with glacial calm what had happened. She had kicked out his 8-year-old son from the bank he owned a majority of without verifying his identity, treating him like a beggar. Jessica desperately tried to justify herself talking about security protocols, but Alexander pointed out the absurdity of considering an 8-year-old child a threat. When she tried to apologize, Alexander explained that she couldn't erase the humiliation inflicted on his son. With a definitive voice, he informed her that she was fired effective immediately, along with every person who had participated in the episode. Jessica tried to plead, but Alexander turned to Matthew, smiling at him with tenderness. As they left the office, Jessica collapsed in her chair, realizing that in a few minutes she had lost everything she had worked for her entire life. Alexander immediately called an emergency meeting of all staff.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
In the first-floor conference room. Within 15 minutes, every branch employee was seated before him, while Matthew and Lucas waited in the waiting room with Elena. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew what had happened, and that consequences would be severe. Alexander stood up and began speaking with a calm but penetrating voice. He told what had happened. An 8-year-old child kicked out of the bank because someone had decided his appearance wasn't appropriate. He wasn't given a chance to explain. His identity wasn't verified. He wasn't treated with human dignity. He explained this wasn't just a personal matter, but about values and principles. He asked direct questions. If they were capable of judging a child, what did they do with clients who didn't seem rich enough? How did they treat elderly people or those who needed help? Some employees were crying. Others looked at the floor in shame. Alexander continued explaining that the bank wasn't just a financial institution, but a public service where people seek security and trust. He announced changes, monthly training courses on social sensitivity, verification procedures before removing anyone, and the principle that every person deserved respect. The most significant moment came when he brought Matthew into the room. The employees stood up one by one to apologize to the child, some with tears in their eyes, all sincerely repentant. Matthew accepted every apology with a smile and said something that stayed with everyone, that the important thing was to learn and do better next time. An 8-year-old child had taught a room full of adults what forgiveness and personal growth meant. In the weeks that followed, First National Bank Manhattan began a transformation that went far beyond replacing the fired staff. Alexander didn't just punish those who had made mistakes. He actively worked to create a completely new corporate culture. The first change was appointing a new branch manager, Maria Santos, a 40-year-old woman who had worked for years in social services before entering banking. Her experience with people from all social backgrounds made her perfect to lead the cultural transformation Alexander had in mind. Maria implemented the most comprehensive training program an American bank had ever seen. Not just courses on social sensitivity, but real workshops that confronted employees with real situations. They invited people from different social backgrounds to share their experiences, organized simulations where employees had to put themselves in the shoes of struggling clients. Matthew's story became the main case study, not to humiliate those who were there that day, but to analyze every phase of the episode and understand where the system had failed. How had such a simple situation escalated so quickly? What psychological mechanisms had led normally kind people to behave so harshly? Alexander personally participated in many of these meetings, often bringing Matthew when the boy was available. Matthew, with his childlike naturalness, had involuntarily become the bank's best trainer. When he spoke with employees, they saw not a billionaire's son, but simply a child who deserved respect like everyone else. The change didn't just concern attitude toward clients. Alexander also transformed the bank's physical environment. He created a family area where parents could let children play, installed free water dispensers, provided comfortable chairs for elderly people, introduced a translation system to help foreign clients. But the real revolution was in the human approach. Every employee was trained to see beyond appearance, to ask kind questions before judging, to offer help instead of creating barriers. The results were extraordinary. 6 months after Matthew's incident, First National Bank Manhattan had won the National Award for Best Customer Service. Social media was full of stories of people treated with unexpected kindness and respect. Elderly clients wrote thank you letters for help received with digital procedures. Immigrant families shared positive experiences of inclusion and understanding. The most significant change was seen on a cold December morning. A homeless man entered the bank, asking if he could use the bathroom and warm up. Instead of being kicked out, he was welcomed discreetly. He was offered hot coffee, and when it was discovered he had identification but no bank account, he was explained how to open a free one for people in financial difficulty. That man was a war veteran who had lost everything due to mental health problems. The kindness received at the bank was the first step toward his social reintegration. 6 months later, he had found work and opened a regular account. His story was told in national newspapers as an example of how financial institutions could be positive forces in society. Alexander followed all these developments with satisfaction, but the real measure of success was Matthew. The boy, now 9 years old, often returned to the bank with his father and was always welcomed with genuine smiles. He knew many employees by name and they knew him, not as the owner's son, but as Matthew, a child who had involuntarily taught everyone a precious lesson. One evening, as they were driving home after a bank visit, Matthew asked his father if he was happy about how that bad story had ended. Alexander looked at his son through the rearview mirror, and Matthew explained that he had been sad that day, but then many people had learned to be kinder. Maybe it was worth it. At that moment, Alexander understood that his son had grasped something much deeper than a simple lesson in justice. He had understood that sometimes painful experiences can become opportunities to make the world a better place. 2 years after the incident that shook First National Bank Manhattan, Matthew had become an even more confident and compassionate 10-year-old. His experience hadn't made him cynical or distrustful, but had taught him the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of appearances. Alexander often reflected on how that difficult moment had transformed into one of the most precious lessons of his life, not just for Matthew, but for himself. He had discovered that true power wasn't in humiliating those who made mistakes, but in creating systems that prevented those mistakes from repeating. First National Bank Manhattan had become a model studied throughout America. Delegations from other financial institutions regularly came to study their approach to staff training and inclusive customer service. Matthew's story had become a case study in business schools, not as an example of corporate revenge, but as a demonstration of transformational leadership. The most significant changes were seen in small daily things. Every morning, when Alexander entered the bank for his meetings, he saw scenes that filled his heart. Tellers patiently explaining procedures to elderly clients, security guards helping mothers with strollers, employees greeting every person with genuine smiles. The new manager, Maria Santos, had established a monthly tradition called Kindness Story. Each month, an employee shared an episode of particular kindness experienced at the bank. These stories were shared with all staff and often became examples for further service improvement. Matthew, when he occasionally accompanied his father to the bank, had become a small celebrity among employees. Not because he was the owner's son, but because his story had changed their professional lives. Many had confessed to him that the experience had made them better people not just at work, but in their private lives too. One day, while sitting together in Alexander's office, Matthew made an observation that deeply struck his father. He said he had learned that when people were mean, it was usually because they were afraid or sad about something. That lady who had kicked him out wasn't really mean. He was just scared of making mistakes. Alexander looked at his son with admiration. At 10 years old, Matthew had developed an understanding of human nature that many adults never reach. When asked what he thought should be done with people who were mean because of fear, Matthew answered without hesitation that they should be even kinder to them, because being mean would scare them even more. That evening, Alexander told his wife Elena about the conversation. She smiled with pride, seeing how their son was growing in wisdom and compassion. She suggested that Matthew should tell his story to help other children who might experience similar situations. A few months later, Matthew participated in a children's TV program where he told his experience, not as a story of revenge or power, but as a lesson about the importance of not judging people by appearance and always having the courage to be kind. The program was hugely successful. Thousands of children wrote letters to Matthew, sharing their experiences of discrimination or acts of kindness they had performed after hearing his story. Alexander transformed these letters into something concrete by creating the Matthew Harrison Foundation for Kindness, which organized educational programs in schools to teach children the importance of respect and inclusion. The most significant moment came 3 years after the original incident. Jessica Stone, the former manager who had kicked out Matthew, requested a meeting with Alexander. She had gone through a difficult period after being fired, but had used that experience to reflect deeply on herself. She thanked Alexander for what she called the hardest but most precious lesson of her life. She had understood that she had lost sight of what truly mattered, treating every person with dignity and respect. Now she worked for a non-profit organization helping homeless people, remembering Matthew's lesson every day. Alexander offered her the chance to share her experience in the bank's training programs as an example of how people can grow and change from their mistakes. That evening, while putting Matthew to bed, Alexander reflected on the extraordinary power of kindness. An 8-year-old child, treated unfairly for a few minutes, had triggered a chain of changes that had touched hundreds of lives. Matthew said he was glad that thing had happened, because now many people were happier. He had learned that even when bad things happen, you can always choose to make them good. Alexander kissed his son's forehead, knowing he had raised not just an heir to his business, but an extraordinary human being who would make the world a better place. The lesson was simple but profound. In a world that often judges by appearances, true wealth lies in the ability to see value in every person. And sometimes it takes a child's pure heart to remind us of that. Like if you believe every person deserves respect, regardless of appearance. Comment about a time when you witnessed or experienced unfair discrimination. Share to inspire others to never judge by appearances. Subscribe for more stories celebrating human dignity. Sometimes it takes a child to teach adults what kindness means. Sometimes a moment of injustice can become the beginning of positive change. And sometimes the most precious lesson comes when you least expect it. Because true power isn't in humiliating those who make mistakes, but in building a kinder world for everyone.